Hello and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Robert Arnason of the Western Producer, your host for this week's show. With $20 per bushel canola, a post-harvest price rally last fall, and massive Chinese imports of feed grains, the 2020-2021 crop year has been full of surprises. On this week's show, we'll discuss the big stories from the crop year and what to expect for the new crop year, which begins on August 1st. We'll also hear from a climate expert with Environment Canada who will explain why prairie weather goes through dry cycles and wet cycles that can last for a decade or longer.
Part of being a farmer is being an accountant, and a mechanic, and a chemist. You have lots on the go, so FarmLink makes your grain marketing go further. We help you reach your financial goals with calculated sales decisions. No bias, just solutions and results. Plus, with our new app GrainFox, we bring every opportunity right to your fingertips. Literally. Start seeing the returns that'll get your family ahead. You've earned it. FarmLink. Your work is worth more. Get started at farmlinksolutions.ca.
On August 1st, 2020, canola futures were trading around $490 per ton. As of Tuesday, July 20th, canola was trading around $910 per ton. The massive price surge in canola nicely summarizes the 2020-2021 crop year, which comes to an end in a week or so. Joining us now to talk about the highlights and high prices of this crop year is Phil Franz-Warkentin, a reporter with Glacier Markets Farm, and Ed White, a reporter and analyst with the Western Producer. Okay, Ed, first question for you about the 2021 crop year. COVID was, as we all know, a massive story this year. What do you think its major impact or principal impact on the commodity markets was? What's your sense of that?
Well, I think across the commodity markets there was, tremendous early disruption as everybody, in every area except food, where, food kept flowing and people got very anxious about securing food supplies. All sorts of commodities, it just either got sort of put to the side for a while everybody's economy went into a bit of a shutdown. But then what has been amazing is just to see the bounce back and to see, commodity trading and commodity markets just completely, rebound and recover surprisingly well. And especially, with the food and ag markets really hardly skipping a beat after initial shocks. They've just got back to business. So that to me was really what, commodity-wise, it's amazing just how orderly things became after the initial shock.
Okay, Phil, same question for you. What stands out for you when it comes to the impact of COVID?
I was going to echo that. When you sent over the points of what we're talking about, I looked back at some old stories, and just over a year ago, it was we're uncertain about COVID and what this will mean for demand and everything, but over the past year, basically since last June, last July, the trend has been up on all of these commodities we're following, which has been quite amazing, really. But the COVID has led to uncertainty and whatnot, but overall the ag sector at least has seen a lot of strength over the past year.
Okay. So I'll continue with you here, Phil. When you look at the big story in the global ag markets in the last 12 months, take COVID out of it, was the big story like the fall price rally? Was it Chinese imports of feed grains? Like, what do you remember writing about constantly last fall and over the winter?
There's been a lot of supply and demand type stuff that the basic thing has been there's supplies are tight on a lot of commodities, and that has led to fundamental strength in the markets. It hasn't just been a rally based off of speculators or technical signals. There's there's been support behind it with, just the general supply and demand tightness has driven a lot of things. And lately, with the blinders on, you see what's in front of you right now. The weather has really become the big story over the past few months.
Ed, what do you remember writing about quite often in over the last year? What are some of the things that stick out for you in terms of commodity markets and larger themes?
Yeah, I'd say, what really struck me in the last year is just how powerfully a bear market in all commodities, including ag, which has lasted from 2014 to now, where, pretty much every commodity's had problems breaking out of a pretty low range of prices. All of a sudden, in the right conditions, when that commodity complex gets moving in a bullish direction, it can just vault into, an incredible rally. I mean, what we've seen is incredible for so many different commodities, and, agriculture is, absolutely a part of that. But it's just amazing how the whole commodity complex could just vault itself out of, years of low prices and weakness and just sustainably stay up for months on end.
I'll stick with you, Ed. Was there any surprises of 2021? I was really caught off guard by what happened in Chicago with the whole Chicago wheat being higher than Minnesota futures for the longest time, which was kind of an unusual market phenomenon. What caught your attention in the last year in terms of market nuances or things that were a bit surprising?
Yeah, I was just really, really surprised, and I was completely wrong in my expectations for how much disruption there would be in sort of farm and food trade. Early on, we had all the stories of slaughter plants having to shut down and milk being dumped and situations like that. And I was absolutely willing to bet that those kind of disruptions would just repeatedly happen. I was thinking slaughter plants would close multiple times, and every kind of processing would just be a nightmare, and they would all get backed up to the farm, and it would just be a dreadful, disastrous, awful year of this. As always, problems get backed up to the farm. Everyone pushes their losses back to farmers. But in fact, it's really quite a stunning success that slaughter and processing across both grains, crops, and the livestock industry, how well they have been able to get back into business and have relatively few shutdowns. And I really had not expected them, especially with some of Canada's very old beef plants. I didn't think they'd be able to re-engineer themselves so that they wouldn't just chronically face, one shutdown after another. And they've done much better than I think a lot of people thought and feared. So that really struck me that the agriculture markets in the real physical marketplace just kept ticking along after initial shocks and disruptions.
Let's move on to our last question. Looking ahead, there's been some talk of $1,000 per ton canola, which would suggest that this, market rally has room to run higher, and it has a lot of, I guess, what the word would be, sort of like legs, that this can go on for months. What are your guys' sense of where things are headed the next 6 months or so? Phil, I'll go with you first.
Yeah, $1,000 is definitely possible. We hit that on the old crop contracts back in the spring. Especially with the weather drought conditions we have right now, it seems every day or so you see someone else coming up with a smaller production estimate. So $1,000 is not out of the cards, I would say. But that said, it's all relative, right? So the $1,000 is a big number, but is it actually expensive? The crushers are making good money at these levels, so it's it's the price that is that will work for the market, as it were. So I'd say a return to $1,000 is possible. I wouldn't have surprised. I would have said that even 5-6 months ago that would be possible, but that's definitely in the cards.
And Ed, what about you? Do you think this market rally, including canola and the cereals and oil seeds, like, has this run its course, or do you see this price surge continuing well into 2022? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me give you two answers, which diverge. Number one is, well, why can't it go higher? Because we've got all the fundamental reasons, and just in terms of if we want to look at charts, I mean, where the price structure is today, that's not $1,000 or $1,100 for canola is not too many standard deviations out of where we are now and where we've been for months. So if we take that as a baseline where we've been for 6 months, well, why can't we go to 1,000 or 11 like we did verged on with old crop? But the other side of that, I would say, is I would go way back to 2012. And I remember I think it was July of 2012 when that incredible Midwest rally was going on, when corn and soybeans were getting ravaged in a U.S. drought. And I called some longtime market analysts and market historian to ask, how do these rallies tend to resolve? Like, where do they go? Like, how high can they go? What's the normal course of events here? And they both told me the same thing, which was these kind of, at least Midwest weather problems that cause rallies in the crop markets, they tend to peak in early August, even if crop conditions get worse and worse through August and into September. They don't just keep going up. They tend to peak by early August, and that can be for a number of reasons, whether you're scaring off buyers, or if the people that really desperately need the crop have already covered all their needs by early August, they moved fast because they were scared of the situation, and the other buyers left are not that as serious, and then the rationing, or for any other reasons. But they predicted that, or they didn't predict that. They just said that tends to be the pattern, and they were completely right that year. It was in August, peaking, and then it just ground down through harvest regardless of worsening conditions. So I don't know. I would say, there's two answers to that question, which is, one is, well, why can't it go higher? It's not so far from where we are today. The other side is, well, traditionally these things tend to blow off by the end of summer. Okay.
Well, we'll find out in a month or two where canola is headed and what kind of yields we're going to get in Western Canada. But thanks to you both for coming on the show. I appreciate it. You've been listening to Phil Franz Workington of Glacier Markets Farm and Ed White of the Western Producer, who shared their thoughts on the big stories from the 2020-2021 crop year. Next up, from 2007 to around 2016, the persistent story in Western Canada was flooded rivers, flooded fields, and farmers struggling with too much water. Then, in 2017, the story shifted to drought and a lack of moisture in many locations across the prairies. In mid-July, I spoke with Barry Bonsall, a climatologist with Environment Canada in Saskatoon, about dry cycles and wet cycles in prairie weather. Here's what Barry had to say about dry cycles. When I talk to farmers, they say things like, well, we're in a dry cycle, so I'm not going to grow soybeans, or we're in a wet cycle, so I can't grow this crop, or whatever. They make decisions based on their perceptions of a weather pattern. When a climatologist looks at the weather data, do you use the term dry cycle, or what term do you use to describe a period or a lengthy period of, unusually hot or dry weather?
Yeah, usually cycles is quite common. Sometimes if you get more technical, they're called oscillations. You know, you go, or different phases of a different oscillation. You go from a positive to a negative. That's mainly with sea surface temperatures and some large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns.
Okay.
For example, you're familiar with El Nino and La Niñas.
Yep.
Yeah, so they're part of something called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So it's something that goes back and forth on a period of between 2 and 7 years. You know, so it's that type of frequency where you go from more of an El Nino state to a La Nina and through neutral states in between. So that's an example of a shorter term oscillation. And there's longer ones out there with sea surface temperatures as well that act on more, they're called decadal scale oscillations. So they're 10 years or longer.
Okay.
And they get into a certain mode and they tend to stay there more often than not for an extended period of time.
I also asked Barry about the shift in weather patterns from a dry cycle to a wet cycle and how quickly that happens. So I just got off the phone with a farmer in the Interlake region of Manitoba, and I remember doing stories in the Interlake in the early 2010s where it was just constantly wet there all the time, and basically farmers could almost not harvest their crops because it was so wet in the fall, and they were all buying combines that had tracks on them so they could harvest their crops. And then boom, all of a sudden come 2017, everything sort of changed. We kind of like flipped the switch to now it's dry. Is this something that happens that quickly, or is it something that kind of happens over several years? Like, how do you characterize the oscillation or the change of a cycle?
You know, it can happen both ways. It can happen very quickly. The historical data is showing it happening very quickly or taking over a period of time. And really, you know, when it happens, like in 2017, it appears that we're going into a drier cycle, but we won't really know this until, you know, another 5 or 10 years from now, or at least 5 years from now to see if it holds. It might just be a little blip in this wet cycle. It's really hard to tell, which is unfortunate when you're trying to make decisions.
So it's actually possible we're still in the middle of a 20-year wet cycle, but we're just not recognizing it because it's dry right now.
Correct. Yeah. But you know, we've had a couple, 3, and you know, even looking at some of the prairie potholes and sloughs, which were expanded like crazy over the last 10 and maybe 15 years, and now they're really drying up fast. So it really looks like if I had to hedge a bet that we're going into a drier cycle, it's looking that way.
Okay.
But you can't say that with 100% certainty by any means.
So it's almost like one of those things where you have to look back at the data to understand what happened. It's harder to know what's happening when you're in it.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's especially hard to predict on years in advance. You know, weather forecasts, we're looking at 5 to 7 days, and they're not too bad, you know, the farther you go out. And sometimes there's seasonal forecasts, or, you know, what's this summer going to be like, or this one, and they're okay. But when you go out to multi-years, it's the toughest part to predict, to know what's going to happen.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. What you touched on this earlier, some of the major factors such as sea temperatures, La Nina, El Nino. Are those things that influence weather circulation patterns, or what does, say, a change in sea temperature in the Pacific mean for Western Canada? Like, how does that play out? Okay.
Actually, our weather here on the prairies and in Western Canada is affected a lot by what's happening in the Pacific Ocean and a lot in the North Pacific Ocean. And it's just that we're in the band of all our weather comes from the west. Mm-hmm. So all the system's highs and lows pressures move from west to east. It's just in the band we're in on the Earth. So it has a big influence on our climate, on our temperature and precipitation. And the sea surface temperatures in certain locations tend to oscillate. These oscillations back and forth from areas where it's warmer than normal, areas where it's cooler than normal. And this is just a natural part of the climate system. It's driven, you know, in fact, there's some research, you know, we don't exactly know what's driving some of these longer term oscillations, but we can pick them up in the historical data. And it's associated, you know, you get into a certain phase where the sea surface temperatures get warmer than normal. It adds a bit more heat and moisture into the atmosphere. It affects the circulation. The circulation, again, affects the sea surface temperatures, and it gets into a certain mode, and it'll stay that way for extended periods of time.
While most farmers on the prairies would assume that we're now in a dry cycle, that's not a certainty. Barry explained that climatologists must look back at the data to determine if a weather pattern is truly in a dry cycle. When will we know that if we are in a dry cycle right now? Because I think a lot of people are making that assumption that we are, because in places like the Interlake, such as I mentioned earlier, what they're seeing on the ground is that, things just are very dry and it never rains anymore in the Interlake and other parts of Western Canada. Mm-hmm. But for climatologists, as you said, we may not know that until 2023 or something.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, and again, it's kind of the balance of evidence. So we're seeing more dry years, maybe in the last 3 or 4, they've been drier than wet, I would say. And we've been in a wet cycle now for, probably since about 2007 or so. Okay. Maybe even 2005, 6. So it's getting to that period, of 15 years or so, where if we look into the historical data, that's about the timeline, the average timeline or so of these wet and dry cycles. Like I said, they could range between 10 and 20. So we're getting to that period where we anticipate a shift to a dry cycle. Whether it's happening right now or not, it's really hard to say. But, the evidence is tending that way. The sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific, I haven't looked in a while here now, but they've kind of been off and on. They're not really tending towards this pattern that sets up drought that I've seen lately. Mm-hmm. But they've it's not to say that they can't go into that pattern, and that would be another balance of evidence if they go into that phase.
And finally, Barry addressed the issue of climate change and how it impacts dry and wet cycles in Western Canada. The weather these days seems to be stickier, or if you get into a certain pattern, it kind of stays there longer. So maybe then climate change could, prolong or extend or make a dry cycle more severe. Is that possible?
It is possible, and actually there's a lot of research going on this topic, and it's still debatable. But there is a theory in that if the poles are warming more than the equator, so we'd have a certain temperature gradient between the poles and the equator, and that's what drives our circulation. So when you reduce that gradient between, you're impacting that circulation, and some studies are saying you actually slow it down. You slow down the jet stream. And when it slows down, it tends to persist in certain areas longer than it did in the past when you had a different temperature gradients. So this is a theory. They're trying to do, there's just not enough observational data going back, especially in the upper atmosphere, where we can test that to say, this is a clear-cut relationship. But there is a lot of work going on this that is impacting. And especially in the Arctic, where the sea ice used to reflect a lot of the sunlight coming in.
What's that word? What is that word? Albedo or something? Is that the word?
Yeah, the albedo. Exactly.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. That's the reflection of the sunlight. So when you had snow and ice there, it would reflect 70 or 80% of the sunlight back. But if you replace that with ocean, it's actually absorbing 70 to 80% or so. So all that heat is being stored now in the ocean, and it has to be released to the atmosphere at some point in time. And again, that's impacting the circulation. Like, everything is connected.
You've been listening to Barry Bonsall, a climatologist with Environment Canada in Saskatoon. That's it for this week's show. I'm Robert Arnason of the Western Producer. Thanks for listening.
part of being a farmer is being an accountant, and a mechanic, and a chemist. You have lots on the go, so FarmLink makes your grain marketing go further. We help you reach your financial goals with calculated sales decisions. No bias, just solutions and results. Plus, with our new app GrainFox, we bring every opportunity right to your fingertips. Literally. Start seeing the returns that'll get your family ahead. You've earned it. FarmLink. Your work is worth more. Get started at farmlinksolutions.ca.